Hello and welcome back to Building Integrity. I'm your host, Josh Porter, and today we're asking the question and hopefully answering the question, what is a story? And no, we're not talking about children's tales or your favorite book, but we're actually talking about the stories in a building. And a lot of us think this is a ridiculous question. Why is he making a video on this? It seems so obvious. Well, hopefully by the end of this video, you'll realize that it's not quite as obvious as you might think. And this raises actually some interesting questions that can have serious implications on how buildings are built, how they're maintained, how they're managed, and codes and ordinances and all that good stuff. And there are some new laws that have come out, particularly in Florida, but there are laws throughout the world that are based on the International Building Code that all really care specifically about this definition of what exactly is a story. And in this video, we're going to talk about the implications in two real world examples, and hopefully you guys can learn something from that with me here today. All right, so the first thing we're going to talk about is Champlain Towers South, and we're going to talk about this penthouse that was built on the top. So this area right here is the penthouse area that was built on top of the building. Now, believe it or not, when this building was being constructed in 1980, the developer approached the city council or the town council and requested that a penthouse be put on top of the building. And there were members in the council that argued, no, we have a 12-story limit on our building. So this floor right here would have been the 12th floor, and they're saying if you put a penthouse above the 12th floor, you are essentially violating our town ordinances, right? Our codes. And so the developer argued that, well, it's just a penthouse, it's not a whole floor, so therefore it falls into this gray area. Now, of course, there's accusations of a lot of colluding and money being exchanged back then between boards and or between the town council and these developers. So who knows what the situation was, but there were a handful enough that they went ahead and allowed the developer to put in this penthouse. Now, this penthouse was added to the building. The engineer did add it, but the engineer really didn't change any of the structural design below the penthouse to handle the extra weight. And so this obviously has sort of been considered as one of the many contributing factors behind why this building collapsed. So he got his 13th floor, which, let's just be real, and by the end of this video, hopefully I will have convinced you that this is indeed a 13th floor. He got his 13th floor, but this wasn't without some sort of opposition. So looking at a news article from the Herald in the 80s, early 80s, I think it was actually in 1980, they state, and I'll just quote you the interesting part here that I've highlighted. It says, in a letter to the council, planning and zoning board member 𝘾𝙝𝙤𝙣𝙣𝙣 argued that a penthouse, now remember, this guy is on the planning and zoning board in Surfside, okay? So he's not like a resident or anybody else. So he's on the council, he's writing to the council, but he is actually a planning and zoning board member. And this is a common theme we see even today, even in my own county, where the county council members or the town members or the city council members will oftentimes ignore the advice of the actual experts. Because remember, council members are typically citizens that get elected to those positions, right? But they should rely on engineers and people who work at the county office to kind of advise them. So here's somebody advising them with the planning and zoning board, 𝘾𝙝𝙤𝙣𝙣𝙣. He says that he argued that a penthouse was a story. It seems almost ridiculous that he has to make this argument, but he makes it nonetheless in 1980. He argues that a penthouse is a story because it is a portion of the building included between the surface of any floor and the roof above it. And so if you see the writer, Elizabeth Morgan here in this article, she actually quotes that, a portion of the building included between the surface of any floor and the roof above it. So she's giving a definition which was presumably given by 𝘾𝙝𝙤𝙣𝙣𝙣 in his letter. So she's quoting him, and I suspect that he was quoting the code at the time. All right. He said the council shouldn't have granted the exception based on this idea. All right, so we're going to get back to why is this a story or why is it not? But I just want to show you, this is sort of one of those things that it comes up and it matters in the real world how we define these things, because it questions, well, what are developers able to get away with? Now, keep in mind, the penthouse was the 13th floor, but it was the 13th floor above grade. In this picture, we can see where Champlain Tower South, the building has already been removed, and what you're essentially looking at is the parking garage area, right? So here is the parking garage floor, but up here is where what we call finished grade is. And so you can see that the parking garage is below the finished grade. So then this begs the question, when does a parking garage itself become a story of a building? Or is it only anything above grade plane? Well, you'll see that the International Building Code actually addresses these questions later on. Now, besides the International Building Code, or inside, I should say, the International Building Code, they define a couple things. One of the interesting things is a threshold building. Now, there's lots of qualifiers for what a threshold building is, but the reason why it's called a threshold building is because it triggers a threshold in the building code, which requires engineers and architects to provide additional inspections and additional work on these buildings. And the International Building Code, and obviously for my Florida viewers, the Florida Building Code follows suit. It states that buildings over 3 stories, in addition to several other possible criteria, but in this case, we're talking about stories. So it says buildings over 3 stories are threshold buildings. Well, you can see why now this is kind of getting important, right? Because what if a building is 4 stories, or it can be argued that it's 3 stories and it's kind of on that gray area? Well, do I need to comply with the codes of threshold buildings or not? In Florida, we actually passed some recently new laws, which I've covered in previous videos. And in the new law, they state that condominium buildings 3 stories and taller must, so on and so forth. So in the real world example that we're going to go through in this video, it's an actual client of mine. It's an actual case that we dealt with, and the question was actually put to us: do we have to comply with this new code, this new law for condominium buildings 3 stories and taller? In other words, they're asking us, is our building 3 stories or taller? And you'll see it can be quite confusing. All right, so let's look in the International Building Code at some of the definitions real quick. And I know this is boring, a bunch of wall of text, but I'll try to hit them real quick. So in the definition in the International Building Code for a story, it describes it as the portion of a building included between the upper surface of a floor and the upper surface of the floor or roof next above. So now we're kind of understanding. So if we look at a cross section of a building, and I'll just draw one real quick here, small, and we have a floor and it has a ceiling below. Now we don't know how big or tall this building is. And then we have a floor and a ceiling below. So typically these might be joists or something like that. What they're saying is that you measure from the upper surface to the upper surface, and that is considered a floor, or a story, I should say, right? But it's measuring from floor to floor. So this is what they would refer to as a story, sorry. Okay. It also, so it kind of gives you the definition, which you can kind of use the definition to arrive at this measurement, but it actually tells you in the next section that you measure vertical distance from top to top of 2 successive tiers of beams or finished floor surfaces. So that's kind of what I drew already down here. And then it says, and for the topmost story, so now we're going to talk about the very top of the building, okay? It says that you measure from the top of the floor finish, so you have a floor here, so you measure from the top there, to the top of the ceiling joist, or where there is not a ceiling, to the top of the roof rafters. So let's say you just have some roof rafters, and you measure to the top of those, presumably vertically, not at an angle like I drew, and this is defined as a story. So far, so clear. These are like easy, low-lying fruit for us to kind of understand and digest very simply. But I just kind of wanted to show you the International Building Code, how they define these things. Now, if you come up here, you'll notice the word mezzanine here. So it says, and I'll go back, it says that a portion of a building included between the upper surface of a floor and the upper surface of the roof or floor or roof next above, but then it says in parentheses, see basement, building height, grade plane, and mezzanine, because all these other definitions really matter. In particular for this video, what matters is the definition of mezzanine. All right, and so I'm just gonna give it to you real quick, but we're gonna return back to this to break it down. But basically the definition of a mezzanine is an intermediate level or levels between the floor and ceiling of any story, and in accordance with other parts of the code. All right, now, Then the International Building Code goes on and defines what a story above grade plane is. And this is going to matter when we talk. Remember, I taught early in this video, I talked about the basement level of the Champlain Tower South, for example, but the basement really, or a parking garage of any structure, is it considered a story when we're talking about these codes and ordinances? Well, in this case, they go ahead and give you, well, what is the story above the grade plane? So they're trying to define for you what is the first story of a building, in other words. And it says any story having its finished floor surface entirely above grade plane, or in which the finished surface of the floor next above is. So until up to this point, it's still not really defining. It's just using circular phrasing where it says surface entirely above grade plane. Okay, like help me define that, right? So it does. It goes on to help you define it. There are two conditions. One, the finished grade plane, that the floor must be more than 6 feet or 1.8 meters above the grade plane. Okay. And then when I'll show you where that grade plane gets measured at. Two, it needs to be more than 12 feet above the finished ground level at any point. And that's very distinct. So they're distinguishing between grade plane and at any point. And there's different units of measurement that matter for that. One is 6 feet and the other one is 12 feet. Okay. And so we'll apply that. But let's go back and look. Let's start talking about this real world example I've been sort of talking about. This is actually one of my clients' buildings. This is a cross-section view, like a slice through an apple, looking through the building. And you can see that you've clearly got a floor here. I shouldn't say floor. Let's use proper terms for this, and I don't want to use loose terms. So we have a story here. That's pretty obvious. We have, like, let's say a door here. We have a door here going in. You know, here's our floor, and here's the floor above it. So remember, we measure from floor to floor, and you end up with a story from the top of the floor to the top of the floor. So we know we've got at least one story in this building. So the question comes in is, I've got this floor and I've got a ceiling here. And I've also got a floor here, though, at this area where they call a loft. So here we've got a floor. And now I am using proper terminology. It's the top of the floor surface where you could stand. Okay, so there are stairs. You don't see the stairs in this picture, but there are like stairs that go up to this area that they are defining as a loft. All right. Now, this is a term that's used in development and architecture, but really what it actually is it is technically a mezzanine. And that's why I wanted to show you that definition of what a mezzanine was before. So the question comes in, and the client essentially had this, and then here you have this building built on stilts, and the grade is presumably somewhere. Okay, grade is somewhere. We don't know yet. As far as our conversation in this video is concerned, we don't know where the grade is. So the question is do I have a story here? Do I have a story here? And I'm putting question marks on these. And then do I have a story here? And so because these are questions, you can analyze this building. You can say, well, this could be a 4-story building, it could be a 3-story building, or it could be a 2-story building. Now you're kind of getting the idea. Do the people who own these buildings and live in these buildings, do they need to comply with these new laws and these new codes? So they really need to understand, how many stories is my building? At this point, with everything we've talked about, put it in the comments section. You tell me right now, before watching the rest of this video, if you think this is a 2-story building, a 3-story building, or a 4-story building, and whether they had to comply with the new law, which requires buildings 3 stories in taller to have all of these additional engineering studies done. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to look first at, we're going to erase these questions, all right? And we're going to look first at this question of the grade. So the grade is measured from the exterior. The grade plane is measured from the exterior envelope of the building and outward. So if we define the building as being between here and here, notice I cut it kind of short on the left because this is actually an exterior. This area here is actually just an exterior stairway area, okay? So if we're going to measure the width of the building here, then the grade plane is anything outside of that envelope. So if this wall plane and this column were to be taken down here, the grade is to the left of this, if you will, on this picture. And this over here is not grade plane. It's under the building. So it's not considered under the International Building Code definitions as being part of the grade plane. It's not part of the grade plane, okay? And then you would have a column here, and you would have grade. Now, the reason why this is kind of important is because everything inside the envelope of the building, it could be lower, and which in the case in our client, it was lower, okay? So the question then comes in, okay, so I have two items. If you remember our definition, we had the 6 feet and we had the 12 feet, right? So 6 feet above grade plane or more than 12 feet above any other point, then we have to call it a story. So in this case, our client had an elevation outside, let's say of 3 feet or a little less than 1 meter, okay? So in this case, they did not meet the first definition. They did not meet definition 1, where the first finished floor was more than 6 feet above the grade plane. So then you trigger the second question. Well, is any point around or under this building more than 12 feet above the finished ground level at any point, right? So the question was is this then more than 12 feet, this dimension here? And what it turned out was that it was approximately, let's say, 5 or 6 feet here. So it did not meet the definition of a story above grade plane. It didn't meet the second definition of that. So because it didn't meet either definition, then technically from this first floor here all the way down to the grade plane, it was not a story. So this area here, I'll just write it real quick, is not a story. From here to here. Okay, it doesn't matter if you measure it from out of the grade plane or if you measure it where I just showed that dimension there, right under the building. It doesn't matter. It's not a story. So that means that this area here is the first story. All right, are we following? Because we're going to build from the ground up and answer these questions. Now this drawing is getting a little messy, and we want to now look at this mezzanine issue. So I'm going to give us a clean sheet here and zoom in a bit, and we're going to look at the mezzanine, the question of this loft/mezzanine. Now we know that this is the first story. We just determined that. Okay, and we know that there's at least a second story in here. So the question is there 3 stories? Is there a second story here and this is a third story? Or is it just a second story with a mezzanine? So what we want to do is we want to go back to the definition of a mezzanine. We want to dissect the definition of a mezzanine. Okay, and a mezzanine is, and every word is important, especially when you're dealing with law or code or anything like that. All right, so a mezzanine is an intermediate level. Notice they didn't call it a story. Level or levels between the floor and ceiling. Now remember, the floor and ceiling by its nature is already the definition of a story, the space between a floor and a ceiling. Or floor to floor, right? Or floor, if it's the top floor, it's the floor to ceiling. So an intermediate level or levels between the floor and ceiling of any story. So, and it uses any story, not stories. It's any story. It's a singular word, and in accordance with, again, the section 505, which is another part of the code. Doesn't matter for this video. So again, mezzanine is an intermediate level, not itself a story, between the floor and ceiling of any story. So let's go back to our zoomed in picture. We know for sure that the top of this ceiling, or top of this floor to the top of the roof is a story. And based on that definition, this area here being a mezzanine, then we know that the mezzanine is simply just an intermediate level contained within a singular story. So in fact, when we analyze this building, this particular building for this particular client, we did not count the mezzanine as a third floor, that loft area as a third floor, but instead we considered it an intermediate level contained within the second story. So we ended up, returning back to this particular client and telling them, hey, your building does not need to meet these new reporting requirements that are in the new statute. And it's not a threshold building. It's technically considered a two-story building. And where this is going to have even more implications further down the road, which I wish I had talked about earlier in the video, but if you've stuck along this long, you probably already put it together in your mind, that the insurance rates, your insurance rates that you pay as a condominium are going to be greatly affected by how many stories your building is. It's already kind of affected by that, but now that you have new laws and ordinances, because you see insurance companies have to cover any upgrades related to laws and ordinances. So for example, if there was a law that was passed that said, hey, if your building is 3 stories or taller and you took a little bit of damage from a hurricane, the whole building needs to be brought up to code. That insurance policy is going to cost you a lot more than if you were only a 2-story building, and you don't have to be fully brought up to code if you only take a little bit of damage. You see how that works? Well, hopefully you guys learned something in this video, and I appreciate you guys watching. Don't forget to hit subscribe and like. Thanks, I appreciate it.